Hey guys, welcome back. Wanted to tackle one of my, I guess, truly new favorite films, Cruising, 1980, directed by the great William Friedkin, and starring the great Al Pacino and the great Paul Sorvino and Karen Allen, who is kind of in it, but not really. Cruising is what I would consider part of the Friedkin Five. The Friedkin Five being what I think are maybe some of the most masterful movies made by the great and late director William Friedkin. Everyone knows The French Connection. They know The Exorcist. They know even Sorcerer, now that there's been a critical reevaluation of that film. But there also seems to have been a critical evaluation of the last two films that I consider part of the Friedkin Five. The movie that I'm going to talk about today, Cruising from 1980, and then To Live and Die in LA from 85, which I think was our first episode of Culted Films. So, Cruising. This is a film that I really did not know a lot about. I had some holes in the works of Friedkin, even though I adored the guy. I don't know why I never took a deep dive into his filmography. And over the past 5 or 6 years, I've corrected that. Cruising, it turns out, is a really controversial, or was a really controversial film even before it came out. It was not critically well received, but like Sorcerer, which is another one of Friedkin's masterpieces that came out the week before Star Wars came out in 1977 and kind of just got pushed out of the way. They've There's been a reevaluation of that film, and I think we're in the midst of that right now with Cruising. You know, people like Tarantino and others really hold this film in warm regard, and I'm really glad that I watched Cruising sort of in a bubble, the way I watched Exorcist 2: The Heretic. Exorcist 2, I watched way back. You know, I was a teenager and was able to go in sort of with a clean slate. I don't know how I managed to do it with Cruising, considering how much, there's so much noise online with regard to films, whether films are good, whether they're bad, whatever it might be. And yeah, I just like, okay, it's Friedkin. Friedkin did The Exorcist. He did French Connection. He gave us Sorcerer. He gave us To Live and Die in LA. He's a master, indisputably. So yeah, I'll watch Cruising. It's Al Pacino. Al Pacino being obviously one of the great true movie stars of the 20th century. I'm like, okay, this has to be a hit. And I didn't even rent it. I bought it outright. Again, that's how much of a Friedkin lover I am. And I'm really glad that I did. I thoroughly enjoyed this movie. Cruising is a true noirish, probably I would say more accurately, giallo sort of murder mystery. For those of you that aren't familiar with the genre of giallo, that's Giallo. It's a yellow in Italian. Those are basically the films that we got early on from people like Dario Argento, Sergio Martino before him, sort of the Italian murder mystery. Very noirish, real calculated use of color and shadow, murder mysteries that almost feel kind of dreamlike. And that's what Cruising is. Cruising is truly an American Giallo. I can think of only one other movie that really meets that criteria that I've seen. And it's another one of my favorites, also from 1980, Dressed to Kill, which I hope to review for the channel soon. I want to make time to show the fellas some of these films that they haven't seen because I think it would blow their minds. But yes, again, very atmospheric, just and almost like a sound and a look that weighs you down. Cruising, while it does have threads of a police procedural, that's not the prominent sort of driving force behind this movie. The premise is Al Pacino, who is playing policeman Steve Burns. He's put basically made to go undercover by NYPD. There's been some murders in the gay leather scene of New York. And this movie was shot in 79, came out in 80. So you've got that very much that gritty, dark, just really, what's the word I'm looking for? You can almost feel sort of like, you can feel the humidity, you can feel the air on your face watching this movie, a lot like The Warriors from 79, another classic. It has that gritty, late 70s New York feel. So Al Pacino, he's sort of put in undercover, and he's got to basically go into this scene and try to find out who the serial killer is who's been randomly, killing dudes that are connected to the heavy leather scene and other places. So uh, it's so interesting to watch this film with Pacino. Obviously, so many of us grew up watching his movies. Watched Scarface almost on repeat. The Godfather, just these Serpico, incredible performances. Sort of these movies that it's almost hard to believe that there was once a time in Hollywood where these roles didn't exist. It's almost sort of like they're perennial performances. Pacino is sort of a perennial actor. He'll exist for all time. But what's most interesting for me about him being in this film, Cruising, not because he's a lead, because he is a lead, he's a movie star, is Pacino is undeniably masculine. Again, he's Corleone, he's Scarface, he's all of these characters, and I don't think anyone out there would ever question Pacino's masculine credentials. It's just he embodies it, and that's interesting because this is a movie he doesn't really talk about. I don't know if it's just that he's uncomfortable with the subject matter, or if he doesn't feel like he did, reach what he wanted to do in the role. He blows it out of the water. So sometimes even great actors are really hard on themselves. But this is a movie that it's not just about a cop going undercover to try to find a murderer. He is a guy who's a fish out of water. He is sort of he's a married guy. He's sort of a straight-laced cop, and he's going into this sort of underground world of heavy leather, and it is so different from anything he's known or has ever seen before. And he's got to be convincing about it. It's interesting to watch him doing his job and trying to be convincing at it and really sort of submersing himself into this world that, again, the average person, let alone the average cop, probably doesn't get that much exposure to. Maybe cops do more than the rest of us, and it works. There's been criticisms that Pacino feels like a fish out of water as an actor in this movie, and I don't think so. I think Pacino was so good, that he looks like he's a fish out of water in the beginning because his character is. And even if maybe he was lost, maybe if he didn't, as the great method actor as he is, didn't have as deep a grasp of the material as maybe he would have liked, man, you could have fooled me, because it's completely believable. You see sort of this arc. You see him sort of, kind of trying to find his bearings in this particular job, and slowly but surely sort of coming into his own in it. The supports in this movie are pretty cool too. You've got some amazing actors from the New York scene in this movie. James Remar, who has been working probably for 50 years, a very young James Remar, who fresh off of The Warriors, another great late 70s New York cult film. He appears in this, not a lot, but a bit. You have the great Paul Sorvino as Al Pacino's captain, who basically is the only one he knows, only one that knows that Pacino is undercover on this job. And man, he plays his role with a heaviness. I think the note that Friedkin gave Sorvino was concentrated sadness, like the pit of sadness. And every single frame with Sorvino in it, the guy is just, it's like he's got the weight of the world on his back, which, the character kind of does. The character has to, make sure that his guy gets in there and stops these murders from happening. And speaking of the murders in this film are executed so much like the Giallo. I don't know what Friedkin's exposure was. I know that he does love Argento. I know I've seen him say that in interviews, but that was decades after this movie was made. But yeah, he had to have had some exposure. I'm not sure, but the kills, as it were, that's one other thing I should mention about Cruising is you can kind of discuss this movie like a slasher film. I think it would fit alongside a lot of the great slashers. You could watch this in a double feature with John Carpenter's Halloween, Friday the 13th, or Lucio Fulci's The New York Ripper. It fits right in there. All of those are extremely atmospheric, effective slasher films. Uh, but Cruising is a bit psychological too. Watching the toll that is taken on Pacino's character while he's undercover is really interesting to watch. There's again, Friedkin builds a level of realism into his films, even when he's dealing with the fantastic, like he did in The Exorcist. He grounds the characters in the world so well that even when things get fantastic or they get sort of disorienting or they get weird, it's what makes that weirdness, that fantastic element, just that much more effective. It has that much greater punch, I think. And Cruising should be up there with The Exorcist and The French Connection in terms of how it's spoken of, because it is that good. It is as good as those films are. I'll fight you on it if you want. I guess I should talk about it. The controversy around this film really erupted even before they started filming. Uh, one of the, I believe, journalists from the New York Village Voice somehow received a leaked copy of the script of Cruising, and the guy sort of looked at it as, okay, this is going to be a really bigoted take on the gay community. This is all about the leather scene, and they're going to think that we're all like this, and obviously, that wasn't what Friedkin was doing. Friedkin found the book that this movie was based on, which was based on a true story, which actually has a link to The Exorcist. And he was just so, I think, mesmerized, hypnotized by the story, which is it's a pretty amazing story, that he couldn't help but dig into this. And ultimately, what Friedkin produced wasn't an anti-gay movie. It wasn't any sort of demonizing of even the leather guys that are in this movie and featured pretty heavily. It's really an indictment of the police, and I'm shocked at how many people can't see that. It also makes me think a lot of people just don't watch this movie. It's very easy. Cruising, I think, suffers from a lot of the same problems that Exorcist 2 does, in that nobody actually watches it. And if they do watch it, they've already been tainted by the groupthink that has surrounded some of these films, as opposed to going into it completely tabula rasa and just allowing themselves to enjoy the film because it's excellent. And yeah, Cruising, again, is a masterpiece. But yes, there was some controversy there, and over the course of the production of Cruising, there you basically had a lot of gay activists going out, and if they were filming in, say, an apartment, they'd be outside blowing whistles, making noise, blowing horns. Sometimes they'd gain access to the apartment next to the apartment where Friedkin and company were filming, and they'd blast the stereo. So what you end up getting in the final product of the film is a lot of ADR, a lot of dubbing. And I think that actually makes this movie 10 times better than if they had been able to use like the original audio. And I say that because, again, Giallo. For those of you that aren't familiar, Giallo films, Italian films in general, whether they're Giallo, whether they're science fiction, these sort of great films like The Psychic or Bronx Warriors or Gladiators 2072, all the Italian films are dubbed. And that's a rule that goes back to Mussolini, back when Italy was fascist, that they couldn't record the audio along with the photography. It had to be dubbed in later because they wanted to make sure that no film that was coming out of fascist Italy was anti-fascist. And for whatever reason, they just held on to this rule. And so you'll get movies from the mid 80s that have this ADR dubbing. It also, I think, at some point maybe made it easier for them to dub it into a bunch of languages. You have the dubbing for the English language market, the German language market, what have you. So that's what they did. Now on Cruising, it wasn't intentional. They had to go back and re-record the dialogue, but it gives it that giallo feel. You can watch Cruising in a double bill with Suspiria. You can watch Cruising in a double bill with Deep Red. You can watch Cruising in a double bill with Bird with the Crystal Plumage, these great Argento giallo films, and you really see just how giallo this Friedkin film is. And it's not just even in scenes where you have multiple people talking. They've got the dubbing going on for uh, what may or may not be the killer. You've got this dubbing going on in places where you should hear more noise. That gives it sort of this nightmare, dreamlike quality that I think sets it apart from almost every other sort of murder mystery thriller of its kind, maybe in the 70s and early 80s. Uh, you've got a really great hard rock and punk rock soundtrack that separates this film. Again, I don't view this as a gay film, but I think if you were going to look at it that way, it also sort of stands apart in that there's no disco in this movie. These are the Leather Boys. They're listening to this hard rock, this punk rock. It's dark, heavy leather. There's a monochromatic sort of blue that covers every frame. It's a undeniably unapologetic, deeply masculine film. Karen Allen is really, I believe, the only female in this movie, and she doesn't figure prominently at all. This is very much a sort of ultra masculine environment, ultra masculine film, uh, and I think that really makes it unique. I think if you wanted to look at it as a gay film, which I really don't think it is. I mean, maybe it is, but there isn't a shred of femininity in this movie. It's incredible how Friedkin was able to craft it that way, and it really works for it. Uh, I've also noticed that this film is actually really well regarded amongst straight directors, straight moviegoers. Like I was really surprised to find out how that you know I don't know if Cruising has a gay fan base. I didn't get that far in it. I would imagine that maybe the people who appreciate film, the cinephiles, may enjoy it. But I was shocked to realize that there's just a ton of straight guys that love this movie. Uh, considering the themes within it. Again, if you are a rational guy or a secure guy, it shouldn't matter necessarily. What you know, where it goes in terms of the film. And people say that it's graphic. I don't think this movie is terribly graphic. I think uh, while there is nudity, while there is sort of simulated acts of things going on, I don't think it's any more. It's actually, I think it's less graphic than The New York Ripper by Lucio Fulci, which again is not saying much. Fulci's, pretty graphic in his horror and his thriller murder mystery films. I don't think it's exploitative. I guess that's what I should say. I've heard some critics online saying that this is somehow a gay exploitation film. It's not. This is a straight up, solid murder mystery thriller. Extremely, again, atmospheric, very textured everywhere. You can feel the streets. You can feel the neon coming off the buildings of New York in this movie, and it's a fun watch. I would like to do a deeper dive on this film with some of the fellas that have reviewed movies with me for the channel, because there's so many layers to this movie. It's not just a great murder thriller. There's a lot of questions about identity, and in terms of Al Pacino, questioning himself in this environment that he's in, and just can't wait to get back to his wife Karen Allen after some of these longer stints out there doing this undercover work. It's a really interesting examination of identity in a very sophisticated, mature, adult way. I feel like some of the stuff we're doing today is exploitative. So much of how we talk about um, personal and sexual identity today, it just seems like so much of it is just so some producer somewhere can prove how progressive she or he is, as opposed to presenting three-dimensional characters and treating people like adults with functioning brains. That's all Friedkin has ever done in his movies, and he blows it out of the water again with Cruising. uh, Pacino, again, it's interesting, was not originally the goal as the lead for this film, and I find that interesting. It turns out I think Friedkin originally wanted Richard Gere, who at this time was, he was really sort of on the rise, and I kind of feel like it's better again. we don't have a version of Cruising with Richard Gere, so you can't really say. Richard Gere is a capable actor. Maybe it would have been great. I like the choice of Pacino instead, though, because Pacino, he's a handsome guy, but he's not a pretty boy. Richard Gere is more of a pretty man, and I feel like it wouldn't have worked because the looks of the guys in this film, they range from sort of like handsome but still masculine to some of these guys are just straight up scary, like rough looking guys. And I feel that Pacino fits into that because while he is a handsome guy, he isn't textbook pretty. Uh, Again, like I said earlier, he exudes sort of that undeniable masculine essence and look. It's effortless for him. He doesn't have to put it on. And so the only I'm trying to think who's like that today. Guys like Tom Hardy, they don't have to try. Whereas I feel like if this movie was done today, we might get, Timothy Chalamet, who is a fantastic actor, but he's a slighter build. He is a prettier man than, say, Tom Hardy or Jason Momoa, what have you. So Pacino, I think, was definitely the better choice here, and obviously, that's the way history went. I do find it interesting that Pacino, like in most of the interviews on this film, commentary on this film, I still haven't found any Pacino talking about this. It's all Friedkin. It's the cops that worked with Friedkin for his research on Cruising that also were the same cops that worked with him on French Connection. So he got access to a morgue, which is in the opening scene of Cruising, which had never been done before. An actual police morgue had never appeared on screen. So again, deep dive work going on here, really sophisticated, really interesting stuff. So don't let some of the subject matter keep you from this film. In closing, the Exorcist connection with this film, and this basically where this movie comes from, is when Friedkin was shooting The Exorcist, when they were doing the I guess the MRI scenes for the character of Regan. The mother's trying to figure out what's going on with her daughter, what type of illness does she have. So that scene where they're doing the spinal tap, they used actual technicians for that. And one of the technicians, a guy named Paul Bateson or Bateman, he was an actual technician, had a real job, worked for whatever hospital or maybe worked for the county. And then I guess a few years later got really wrecked by alcoholism, lost his job, and kind of was resorted to kind of stealing. Well, it turns out that this guy, who was the Exorcist technician, meets some guy at a bar. And I think maybe it was a leather bar. And anyways, they sort of, they strike up a conversation. Well, he goes home with the guy, and in an act of desperation, he ends up killing the guy for like $53, which is just, shoosh, dark stuff, I know. And so, that's basically where Cruising comes from. There's, he kills this one guy, may have killed some others, and then other murders happened that he claims he wasn't connected to. All of this figures right into the film, and it's kind of a fun whodunit in a way, and it's pulled right from the reality, and it just happened to be this guy that Friedkin worked with years earlier on The Exorcist. He ends up being part of this real life murder story. So it's you can see why that would be sort of irresistible to a guy like Friedkin, who's cerebral and sophisticated, smart, just has an eye for that type of thing. Friedkin actually got a guy off of death row back when he was doing local Chicago TV. That's where Friedkin got his start. Friedkin is a proud Chicagoan, like yours truly, and started in local Chicago TV and did everything from children's shows to documentaries. Ended up coming across a story of a guy who was on death row who insisted he was innocent, and he did a deep dive like he would end up doing on his films, and basically got the guy freed, realized that no, this guy was sort of sold up the river. And that's something that's, I think, not to spoil too much for you guys, lazy cops that need to solve crimes and solve murders. Sometimes they'll just like, God, well, how much can we pin on this dude? We got to close the book on this. We got to move on. That figures largely in the case that Friedkin helped the guy get freed in his documentary years ago in Chicago. It figures in the real life story that would influence Cruising. It figures in the actual film Cruising. And again, I don't think this is a movie that in any way exploits gay people at all. It's not an indictment or a sad commentary on gay people, on the leather dudes, but I think it really is on policing, and policing the way it was done and how it still is done. There's plenty of pressure in the criminal justice system, not just by police but by DAs to just close it, get it done. And some of these sociopathic people that work in high places don't care. Uh, Not start to get in the weeds on that, but that level of realism is again what makes Friedkin and his films great, and it's built in to Cruising from 1980. What else here? Yeah, I think it's a really great objective assessment, because this is something that exists. Leather bars exist. The S&M scene exists. One critic was trying to say that it doesn't, and I'm like, I know for a fact that it does. And that's the thing too, is I could understand why the gay community in the late 70s probably weren't hot on this movie coming out. It's a lot of stuff we take for granted today. There's been a massive amount of progress for gay people to be able to visit their partners in hospitals and be able to get a civil marriage license like other first class citizens. This didn't exist back then. Gay people couldn't serve in the military, and even though maybe it wasn't illegal in certain states and cities, you could still lose your job. And many did. So I could see why there'd be a sensitivity to this material being presented. But again, Billy Friedkin, smart cookie. He did not go into this, and there's no part of this movie that tries to present the leather scene or the S&M scene as mainstream. In fact, this is how brilliant Friedkin is. He actually has Paul Sorbino's character, the police captain, deliver a line early in the film as he's talking to Al Pacino's character before he's trying to talk him into going undercover. He's talking about these two guys that have been murdered, and he says, so and so and so and so were not in the mainstream of gay life. They were into heavy leather. Boom, right there. And if that guy from the Village Voice had maybe noticed that line, maybe he wouldn't have been so, I don't know, vigilant to sort of tear the movie down. I understand the sensitivity for the time, because the gay rights movement as a movement, it only started, I think, in the late 60s by then. You have the Black Cat riots in LA. A year later, you have the Stonewall riots in New York. And so this movie being shot in 79. So it's only a decade that this is going on. So the sensitivity makes sense. And so while I am empathetic to that, I'm also sympathetic and empathetic to freedom of speech and freedom of expression. And, I'm glad to see the progress that's been made, okay? But I'm also glad that maybe some of the challenges that William Friedkin and company encountered on this movie ended up making it better. If they hadn't had to do all the ADR on this film, it wouldn't have given it that additional characteristic of a giallo. In addition to how the murder scenes are shot, how it's framed, the coloration, the shadowing, all in the script. It's so pure giallo, but that little extra bit of the ADR and the dubbing really, I think, puts it over the top. Quentin Tarantino disagrees. He thinks that because there is that threat of the police procedural, that it somehow it disqualifies Cruising from being a giallo. I think that's splitting hairs. I think it is absolutely an American giallo, along the lines of Dress to Kill, 1980. I don't know what was going on in 1980. We're getting all these great murder giallo classics, but I'm glad we did. But this movie is worth watching. And again, I was really stunned to find out how many straight dudes were reviewing this movie on YouTube and had written about it and were familiar with it and enjoy it. It's one of Tarantino's favorites, and it is definitely one of mine. It is Another masterclass, masterwork from William Friedkin, and it is as good as anything he did across the 70s, and it's worth watching. So yeah, if you're bold and you just want to watch something original, a fun movie, I watch as much new stuff as I can, but man, do I find myself going back to the classics, going back to the 60s and the 70s a lot lately. I don't know if I'm, possessed by Tarantino or whatnot, but we aren't making movies like this anymore, and that's a shame because we really need to, because I think it would get butts back in the theater. I really do. We're playing it safe right now. I really feel like, in so many ways, economically we're in the 70s, but I feel like creatively we're kind of in the 80s, where everything is super safe. Everything has to be, corporatized to death. Everything is sort of ground down and filed down, and as a result, just a lot of boring stuff going on. So yeah, if you want something new, you want something different, you want something thought provoking and worth watching, Cruising 1980, guys, and follow it up with Dress to Kill 1980, by the great Paul Schrader. That's a night at the movies. Definitely make some popcorn, pop those two in a night. So yeah, guys, Cruising, check it out. And if there's anything I've missed, if there's anything like this, again, I off the top of my head, I can only think about those two Giallo, American Giallo, Dress to Kill and Cruising. If there's anything like that, of that caliber, that you guys can think of, please drop it in the comments below. If you have, strong feelings about Cruising, if there's anything you think I missed, let me know. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye, guys.